Welcome to Managing Toxic Stress and Burnout 7 Types of Rest. My name is Merlene Tucker, and I'll be running today's web forum along with my colleague Jeff Bornstein. Today's web forum is sponsored by the National Overdose Prevention Network, a program of PHI Center for Health, Leadership, and Impact, and produced by Dialogue for Health. It's time to meet the moderator of today's event, Amy Max. Amy is a senior program manager at PHI Center for Health Leadership and Impact, where she oversees the design, strategy, and continuous quality improvement of multiple public health programs and initiatives. She currently manages operations for the center's overdose prevention portfolio, including an annual accelerator program for local overdose coalitions and the National Overdose Prevention Network, which provides training, resources, and learning opportunities to more than 6,000 leaders nationwide. Welcome, Amy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marlene, and thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar. So here are our learning objectives for today, and we have run this webinar several times through NOPIN, and every time we get a really large turnout. And it's really no surprise, since we can't ignore the huge need to address the toxic stress and burnout that so many of us face in our lives. I'm really encouraged by the fact that more and more we as a society recognize the deep importance of taking care of our own physical, mental, social, and emotional needs. We know that you all dedicate your time, energy, passion, and professional lives towards taking care of others through the hard but life-saving work of substance use and overdose prevention. And this hard work takes a toll. And even though it might seem cliche, we can't take lightly the deep reality that we can't be effective and sustainable in our own work of helping others if we don't put the time and attention into our own well-being. Just like they say, when you get on an airplane, we have to put on our own oxygen mask first before helping others. So with that, I thank you for taking the time to join today's webinar to learn more about the impact of toxic stress, what it is, and some real strategies that you can use today to start addressing burnout in yourself and among your colleagues. So let's go on to the next slide for our agenda. We're going to do some poll questions first, just to get a better sense of who we have here across the country. And then we'll have a presentation from our speaker and an opportunity for Q&A. And then the slide after that, because I am pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Jasmine Nakagawa. Jasmine is a former special education teacher whose interest in mental health training grew from working with underrepresented teens and adults around them. For the past several years, she's worked as a certified grief recovery specialist and a certified mental health first aid instructor in the adult, youth, and teen curricula. Jasmine holds a BA in studio art from Mills College, an MBA, and an education specialist teaching credential. And she's currently completing a trauma-informed specialist credential as well. In her spare time, she enjoys cooking Japanese food and playing outdoors with her 3 kids. So thank you so much for joining us, and take it away, Jasmine.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to NOPIN for having me. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about a topic that I think is really near and dear to us all. I want to acknowledge, first of all, what an honor it is to be in a room full of folks who are doing this really important work in community, and the life-saving work that you all are doing in the world of substance use and substance use disorder is so critical, especially at this time. And so I'm just really grateful that you've set aside some time to be here with us today. May I have the next slide, please? So what we're going to be talking about today is managing toxic stress and burnout. And I'm here representing an organization called Cypress Resilience Project. We are a program of Public Health Institute, and we do community-based trainings in mental health first aid, grief recovery, and trauma-informed practice. And This is probably one of the most requested workshop topics that we teach just across all of the different kinds of trainings that we do with folks. And so we aim to give you some really practical tools and resources that you can implement in your everyday lives to try to alleviate some of the stress that you may be feeling that surrounds the work that you do. And so I'm hoping that you'll walk away today with some really practical tools that you can use. Next slide, please. So I like to start off our trainings with this quote: "The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet." Right? And so that quote just means that in this, the work that you do in interacting with all of your different community members and clients and consumers that you serve, you are interacting with a lot of pain and suffering, right? And loss. And on a daily basis, you may be experiencing conversations with people who are navigating the toughest times of their lives. And that is bound to have an impact on you, right? And in many times in helping professions, we say, we devote so much time and attention and energy and focus to the people that we are trying to take care of. And we don't turn a lot of that compassion inwards. And so this workshop today, I really want you to try to think about what are some of the things that you can implement in your everyday life starting today that might help to alleviate some of the stress you may be feeling. Let's go to the next slide. Um, so I just want to reiterate again that especially as we continue to grow and diversify the workforce that is helping people navigating substance use disorder, we want to focus on ensuring that workforce is well supported. So, in addition to talking about some specific strategies that you can use in your everyday lives, I also want to spend some time in this workshop talking about organizations and how we can support the people that are in the workforce to ensure that we are not re traumatizing folks, but in promoting healing. All right, next slide, please. So let's start with a definition of trauma. And you might wonder why we are going back to trauma. But remember, if we're thinking about vicarious trauma as something that is impacting all of you that are doing this work, all of us that are involved in the helping professions, then we've got to know what we're dealing with, right? So when we look at this definition of trauma, it says individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. It's a mouthful. There's the parts of this definition that I like to highlight are that often when we think of trauma, we're thinking of one single event that happened to somebody, right? Like, oh, that person went through a traumatic event and it has had a mental or emotional impact for that person. But let's complicate that definition a little bit, right? Because when we think of trauma as an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances, then we're also thinking about the person maybe who has not felt safe in their home for some time, or maybe didn't have access to the resources they needed, like food, for some time. And if that experience also counts as trauma, then we have to remember that when someone discloses something like that to us, that they are much more at risk for navigating substance misuse, substance use disorder, mental health challenges. And we also have to remember that this trauma can have a lasting adverse effect on the individual in lots of different ways, right? So sometimes we think about trauma as maybe just having a physical or emotional impact or a mental health impact for the person. But the truth is that it's multifaceted, and it can have a physical impact. It can have an impact on that person's relationships, on the social structures surrounding them, their spiritual and emotional well-being. All of it is impacted. And the other part of this, in that second bullet point, is that the more helpless we feel, the greater the impact of the trauma, the greater the impact is of that trauma on us, right? So I like to think about an example of when I was a little kid. I was probably like maybe 6 years old. I got lost at the mall. I was with my dad. And to this day, I still remember, over 30 years later, the feeling of panic that I experienced at the mall that day when I lost sight of my dad. And that sense of helplessness, looking in the crowd for him, my heart pounding a mile a minute in my chest, like that feeling is something that has become a core memory for me. And as an adult, I've been lost plenty of times, right? But the difference is that as an adult, I had lots of resources at my disposal. All I do is pull out my phone, map where I'm going, and get back on track. And it doesn't have the same impact as it had when I was a kid. And so I think it's a perfect sort of example of how the more helpless someone is to change their situation, the more impactful that trauma is for them, for their body, for their emotions, for their mental health. And if you think about systems, it can be really difficult for us to feel like we can have make any sort of difference in systems that are traumatizing folks, in intergenerational and historical trauma that exists for folks. Even for you in your profession, maybe it's that you're showing up to work and you think, I feel like I'm, spinning my wheels day in and day out doing this work, but do I really make a difference? And when you get to that point of helplessness, it stands to reason that vicarious trauma is going to be present for you. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Next slide, please. So I have here an image of the brain, and this is actually one of my favorite slides because I think it grounds us in just really quickly how the neuroscience works, right? So the part of the brain with that blue circle that you see right there that's lit up is the prefrontal cortex. That is our thinking brain. That's where logic lives and where our empathy is, where we make complex decisions, where we weigh the options, like all the pros and cons, where we tell the difference between right and wrong, right? That's all right here. And then if we can hit the animation, yep. So that part of the brain is our survival emotion brain, right? The limbic system. This is the part that helps us to survive. And this is the part that regulates our emotion, our behavior, our motivation. This is the survival instinct part of our brain. And we need both in order to work together, right? We need both of those things in order to be out there in the world as a thinking human, but also as a surviving human. So if you hit that next animation, you'll see we got to have them both together. And so I'm not saying that one is better than the other, that there's any sort of hierarchy here, but I do want to note that when we are activated, when our trauma and our stress response is activated, that thinking brain, that prefrontal cortex goes offline, right? And if you think about that, um, there's reason for that. We evolved from our hunter-gatherer ancestors, right? And when our hunter-gatherer ancestors were out there looking for food, if they had a tiger approach them, right? And that tiger is there growling at them, coming, approaching slowly, maybe that thinking brain is not what they needed. The thinking brain is, we're not going to sit there and say, I wonder what that tiger's intentions are. Wonder if that's a nice tiger or a not so nice tiger. Wonder if he's had anything else to eat today. Is he going to eat me? We're not thinking about all of those things, right? What we are trying to do is to survive. And so that thinking brain shuts down and that limbic system activates, and it's designed to keep us alive. That's when we have to maybe fight, or maybe we flee, or maybe we freeze so the tiger doesn't see us, or maybe we appease the tiger by throwing the meat that we already have out there so we can get away, right? But our brain has a purpose, right? It shuts down that prefrontal cortex and our limbic system becomes in charge. And so when you are navigating a situation with somebody who is activated, that's what you're getting, is that limbic system, not the thinking part of their brain that decides what's right and what's wrong, or is making empathetic decisions or making complex analysis of, the pros and cons. And what happens is that when you are exposed to those stressors in your life on a regular basis, that limbic system becomes really sensitive and activates constantly, And if you are stuck in a situation where your limbic system is constantly being activated, that stress response is constantly being activated, even though there's no tiger there, even though you're just sitting at your desk, maybe having a conversation with a colleague or a client, then that is going to have impact. Let's look at the next slide. So on this slide, you'll see some of the signs of toxic stress that I'm talking about, right? So when that stress response is constantly activated, you may experience some of the things on this slide. And so I want all of you to take a look at this slide right now and just kind of read them through and think to yourself, are there any of these things that you have experienced before, just like related to the stress with your job or with life? I see some reactions coming up for folks. Yeah, lots of thumbs up and hearts. Yep. So when your body and your brain are in a constant state of activation, right? Even when there's no tiger in the room, it stands to reason that we are going to experience some of these signs of toxic stress. And I'll take a couple of examples that I think are pretty common. So for me, I'll just use myself as an example. In the past few years, we've been through some really difficult times. Like Amy said at the beginning of the webinar, I am a single mom of 3 kids. And when we went to shelter in place and folks were doing distance learning, my littlest one was still an infant. My middle one was in preschool and had just been diagnosed with autism. And my eldest was trying to do 3rd grade on Zoom. And then it was a full-time job and all of the things. So it's been a pretty stressful few years, right? And so I was experiencing a ton of muscle tension, like right here in my shoulders. I don't know if anybody else gets that, but like right here, and back spasms and just all of these. And so um, we know that there is a physiological connection, right, between these signs of toxic stress and what's going on with us in our brains. So the muscle tension and spasms can be explained by the cortisol flooding your system, because when you have a tiger in front of you, your body is preparing to survive, right? So that thinking brain shuts down and that tiger's coming at you, and your body is going to flood with cortisol and get you ready to either fight or run, right? And if you are getting ready to fight or run away as fast as you can, your muscles are all at the ready. There's tension there. You're ready to sprint at the fastest you've ever sprinted in your entire life. You hear those stories of moms being able to lift an entire vehicle off of a child with that super strength, right? That's what that is. So if you're sitting at your desk and you are activated in that same way because your brain doesn't tell the difference between that tiger and that other stressor that's impacting you, then your body is preparing for that fight or flight, and your muscles are super tense, except that there's no tiger there and you're not running anywhere. And so that's what causes some of that muscle tension. Another really common one that folks say to me when we do this training is that they experience food cravings. I had that a lot during the pandemic as well, and in the last couple of years, some weird food cravings during the pandemic. And if you think about the kinds of food that you crave when you are stress eating, right? We are not stress eating a kale salad. It's not like, oh, I'm going to eat some spinach right now because I'm so stressed out. Most of the time, at least for me, it was, yeah, people are laughing because you feel me, right? But it's, we reach for those high calorie, high sugar, high carb foods because our body thinks that we're going to run away from that tiger and we need that quick hit of energy, right? That quick fix of energy. So we're going to get out of here. But the reality is that we're sitting at our desk stress eating a pint of ice cream, and that's not helpful to us. So those are just a couple of the examples on this slide, but there's a lot of things that we can experience in our bodies that are signs of that toxic stress. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to say here that when we are working toward this goal of brain wellness, it cannot be a one size fits all strategy, right? And there's no way, if there were a way to give you the magic solution and say, like, here's the list of things that you need to do in order to alleviate the toxic stress that you're experiencing, I would totally give it to you. I would use it for myself. But the reality is that what works for one person, what works for me may not necessarily work for you. And we all come to this work with different lived experiences, different contexts. The context in which we're working is different. And so I can't give you a one size fits all strategy. Um, but I can give you some tips. So let's go to the next slide. And the first is that this is about setting boundaries. So removing as many of the stressors from our environment. And you see here, we put in italics as much as possible. I know that this is much harder to do than to say. You can say, yeah, I'm going to set all the boundaries. I'm going to tell people no. And then when you go to implement it, it is so hard. People tell me all the time, like, you can't help everyone. You can't, like, don't say yes to all the things. Like, why are you taking on so much? And I say, okay, I'm going to set a boundary and I have the best intention to do it. And it's really hard, right? And so I want to acknowledge that this is a spectrum. When we say remove stressors, I'm not saying that you need to cut something out of your life entirely. Sometimes it means that you're just taking a little break. Right. So we know that stress is a natural part of our environment. There's no way that you can avoid stress at all for the rest of your life. That would be nice, but it's not possible. So, what we need to do is pay attention to how it's impacting us, identify what the stressors are for us, and then figure out how to remove even just a little bit for a little bit of time from our lives. And the way that I suggest we do this is by mindfulness practice, right? And so whatever that looks like for you, spending some time to evaluate what is it that is a stressor for you. And that could be like at the end of every day, just sitting and being aware of how, the different feelings that you're feeling in your body. Like for me, when I realized I was experiencing all of that muscle tension, I had been experiencing it for months before I realized, like, oh, why are my shoulders always tight? You kind of get used to living with it, right? And and so it's spending time checking in with your body, noticing the trends. So like if I'm feeling a certain way today, um, is there an interaction that I had today, or a person I was exposed to, or some news that I heard, or in an environment that I was in today that might have caused this to happen? And if you do that on a regular basis, you may start to see some trends, right? Like, oh, every time I spend time around that particular person, or every time I go to this particular place, my body is having a stress response. It's a really important thing to notice, right? And again, we go back to that spectrum. So maybe it means that if you realize that that person or that place or that activity is causing stress for you, you limit your exposure to it. It could also mean that you cut it out of your life entirely. So maybe it's like, hey, I got to take a 10-minute social media break every day because that's going to be healthy for my brain. Or maybe it's like, I cannot be in this relationship with this person, or I cannot have this job. And those are individual decisions that we have to make for ourselves. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is that all of us have stressors that we can't cut out of our lives, right? Like entirely. There are things that we even so, for example, I got 3 kids. They're not going anywhere. They're gonna be here tonight when I'm done with work. They're still gonna be hungry and want dinner. They, they require a ride to school. Like, there's no getting away from that stressor. I'm not gonna be like, "Hey, I'm sorry, I can't be mom anymore," right? But, um there are things that I can do to ensure that I can manage the stress, right? So if I know that it's going to be a particularly busy week with the kids, or if one of my kids is going through something really difficult, then I know that I have to bookend that interaction with time and space for myself to process. Maybe it means that like they know that I'm gonna spend 10 minutes like taking my shower. Nobody is allowed in the bathroom when mom's taking my shower, right? Maybe it's that if I know my son, the one with autism, is going to have a really difficult therapy appointment, that after that therapy appointment, we're ordering takeout. I'm not cooking, right? There are certain things that I can do for myself if I plan ahead, to ensure that I have the space and that I'm forgiving myself and giving myself a little bit of that time and space to just reground, and it allows me to be present and be a better mom for them. So if you have a stressor that you can't cut out of your life, make your plan for what are you going to do to support yourself before and after that exposure. Next slide, please. So let's get into the part about rest. And this is really neat. So this is according to Dr. Sandra Dalton Smith, there's 7 types of rest that we need to access. And I think a lot of us are like, okay, rest means sleep, right? We have a very one-dimensional definition of what it means to rest. And we know that sleep is really important, like sleep hygiene, getting that kind of rest, physical rest is really important. But it's not the only type of rest that we need. Remember when we talked about the definition of trauma at the beginning of this webinar, we talked about trauma as being multifaceted, right? As having a physical impact, a mental impact, emotional, spiritual. And so if the trauma is having all of those different impacts on our life and on our being, then it stands to reason that we have to also think about rest holistically, right? And so we've got these 7 different types of rest that we want to incorporate if possible. So let's go to the next slide. The first is physical rest. And what I want for you to do is, if you have a piece of paper and a pen handy, that maybe jot down some ideas about how you might apply this in your life. Because again, like, I can't tell you what to do because we all come from different stressors, different life experiences, but I really want you to take away something practical from this workshop. So if you've got a pen and paper handy, like, maybe jot down some ideas in each of these categories. So physical rest has 2 forms, active and passive. And we basically, the goal of both active and passive rest is ensuring that your body is in a peaceful state, however it is that you get there. Some of us want to maybe take passive rest, which is like hanging out in the backyard at the end of a long day, like just giving us some space and time to lie around and, like, in the sunshine, or whatever it is, in the fresh air, maybe cuddling with a pet, something like that. And then others of us would prefer, active rest, where maybe it's yoga, or maybe it's walking that pet, or I like to go to the gym and lift weights, and that for me is like, if I can only focus on what's happening with my body in that moment, then I'm not thinking about the million things that are running through my mind, right? So physical rest is really important for us to incorporate. And then I also want to note that there is a handout with some examples that you will all have access to. So there are different examples of each type of rest in the 7 different categories that you'll have access to for this webinar. Next one, please. Mental rest. So I don't know about you, but my mind is often going 1,000 miles a minute between work and my responsibilities at home and traffic and all the things that we've got to do. And sometimes it can be really hard to fall asleep at night, or I'm sitting there and I want to rest, but I don't know how to shut my brain off, right? And if you are somebody who struggles with that, then one of the suggestions we have is to find a way to download that mental volume. It just means that you've got too much going on in your mind right now. And so if there's a way to get some of that out of there, then it can help us for our brain to rest. And remember that when you're thinking about all of the things that you've got to get done, your brain is not safe in that moment, right? So when you're thinking about all the things that happened, all the things that have to get done, if you're worrying about the future or thinking about something that happened in the past, you may be activated, and that is not a safe space for your brain. So one of the things that you could do is maybe set a timer for 10 minutes and wild write everything that's on your mind down with no judgment. Just like anything that crosses your mind, put it all down on paper. That can be really helpful to get that stuff off of your mind. Other examples that really work are things like talk therapy or journaling. Maybe you've got that one friend that you call up that you know will listen to you vent without any judgment, and that's the sort of release that you need in order to rest your brain. So think about what that is for you to get that mental rest. Next one, please. This one is sensory rest. So sensory overload is definitely real. And remember, our limbic system is constantly, like, even without your awareness, is constantly analyzing data from external sources, right? So you're constantly watching all of the things that are going on around you, assessing whether or not you are safe. And especially if you have your own lived experience of trauma, you may be on hyper alert all the time, thinking like, is that person safe? Is this a safe place for me to be? That sensory overload becomes really intense for you, right? So and for me, so I have a lived experience of trauma as well from my childhood, and things that are difficult for me to manage sometimes are when I'm in a chaotic environment where things are very, very noisy, and also physical touch can be difficult for me. And I told you I'm a mom of three, right? So the physical touch and the constant noise, like, it is chaos around here. I have a 4-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 12-year-old, like, two of them are boys. They're just running around all the time. And so sensory rest for me may look like a break from being touched, right? Maybe it means that I allow myself space and time. So under a weighted blanket, like, where I'm in a separate room, and I give myself 10 minutes to have that sensory rest. And I do it intentionally, not only at the times when I'm activated, right? If I build it in as a routine, then it makes my brain more resilient and able to manage all of the other sensory items that I can't control. So this is individual, and it's, some people, remember that for some people, sensory rest, like silence or darkness, can be activating, right? So I want you to try this out. Maybe you don't go cold turkey. And if it's that you want to limit the noise in your environment for a little while, but you don't want complete silence, maybe it's that you turn on some white noise or nature sounds, something like that, so that it's not fully silent, because we know that that can be activating for folks sometimes too. So just pay attention to what works for you. All right, the next one is creative rest. This is one of my favorites. So, this just means allowing yourself the space and time to be who you really are, without expectation, without fear of judgment, without sort of feeling the need to perform for anybody else. And it's not necessarily an art practice, right? It could be. Some of us are really creative, some of us are artists, but it could also be that time spent gardening. It could be playing a sport. It could be just cooking a favorite meal, being present with people that accept you for exactly who you are. That creative rest is like when you're allowing yourself to be who you truly are out in the world, without apology and without judgment. Next one is emotional rest. So I'm going to talk about the next two kind of paired together. Emotional rest and social rest go hand in hand, because this is really about connection, right? So this is about connecting with other people and bonding. And so often we talk about, so I don't know that we're all in helping professions. I'm sure that you are also inundated with all this messaging about how we're supposed to practice self-care. And at Cypress, we often talk about how much we dislike that term self-care, because we know that healing has to occur in community with others, right? It has to happen with the support of the people who care about us. We don't heal in isolation. That's not how the human brain works. And so emotional rest is about being connected to other people who don't judge you, who make you feel safe, that ensure that you have the space to be yourself. And one of the exercises, so I work with teenagers, and one of the things that I ask them to do as one of their assignments at the beginning of the year is to start a list of people that they know can be that for them, right? So who are your safe people? Who are your supporters? And I encourage them to populate that list with both adults and with their peers. And I just want them to know, like, who are their supportive people? Who's my go-to if I need to vent? Who's going to allow me to be my wild self and just say all the things that I want to say, tell my quirky jokes, and they won't judge me for it? We all have those people, and we need those people. So think about who yours are, right? And those are the people that are going to give you that emotional rest. Um, and then also that social rest. So for for those of us who are introverted. So I'm an introvert. It takes a lot of out of me sometimes to be in a social situation where there's a lot going on. And I think that's true for everyone, especially if you're in a profession where you're interacting with folks all day. You are carrying the weight of a lot of people's life stories and experiences and the difficult things that they're going through. And that has an impact, right? So social rest just means giving yourself the space to be alone if you need to, or to turn down an invitation if that's what works. We often feel so obligated that, like, if an invitation comes through, we have to say yes. We don't. We don't. So give yourself permission to turn down that invitation, or give yourself permission to turn down that invitation and then spend time with the folks that do feel like they restore you, right? I always think of it as like, what's going to take the energy out of me and what's going to give the energy back to me. And if I feel like I need that social or emotional rest, then I'm spending time with people who are going to give that energy back to me. And it's about evaluating after the interaction, do I feel more tired or less tired? If I feel less tired, if I feel restored and rejuvenated and like, man, that was a really good time, like I got to be myself, that's when you know you've hit your go to of the people that restore you, or those social situations that do restore you. So you can go on to the next slide. Um, and so that's exactly what I mean, that the social and emotional rest kind of go hand in hand because they are about human connection. And while it is necessary for us to connect with other people and other beings in order to be healthy and well, it also means that sometimes we've got to set boundaries around that to ensure that we're doing it with intention. All right. So the last type of rest, so we'll go on to the next slide, is spiritual rest. And for some people, this means a spiritual or religious practice, but it doesn't have to be, right? This is about being connected to something bigger than yourself. So maybe it's being out in nature. Like for me, if I go out where I can see the stars and I look up and I realize, oh my gosh, the sky is so huge and there are so many stars. Like that feeling of insignificance can feel really comforting to me. But I feel connected to something bigger than myself, right? Sometimes it means for folks, um, the mission of the work that you do. So regrounding yourself in, the job and the impact that you're having, the positive impact that you're having in the lives of so many other people, and the understanding that, like, there are so many people on this webinar right now. Y'all are all doing it together, right? You've got this amazing community of people who with the same common goal of trying to save lives and trying to help with this issue that sometimes feels insurmountable, of substance use disorder and substance misuse in our communities. You are all out there doing this work together, and so that is an amazing thing to connect to, right? um, Sometimes it means doing community service and being connected to maybe a different part of your life in community. So my daughter attends a Japanese school, and I'm part of a Japanese American association in my community, and um, participating in cultural events there makes me feel connected to something that's bigger than myself. And I love that. So this is where we're looking for a connection to something bigger. And that's what gives you the energy to keep going when things are tough, right? To keep going, even though you've just met with a client who's in a really difficult situation, or where maybe someone feels really helpless. It allows you to ground yourself in that bigger mission. Um, and this is really important because we need you. We need you to continue the work that you're doing. Um, and this rest, all of these kinds of rests are going to enable you to do that in a way that is healthy for you so that you're not suffering at the end of the day. Okay, next slide, please. So I talked a little earlier about micro routines, right? And this is just, this means that all of the different kinds of rest that we talked about cannot be accomplished if you only do it like once a year. You cannot grit your teeth and bear through every difficult conversation, every stressor at work, all of the hard days, looking forward to the vacation that you're going to take next August, because that's not how our brains work. We need a little bit of that healing every single day. And so at Cypress, we advocate for building in micro routines, which means creating predictability in your daily activities. So every single day, I journal for 5 minutes, or every single day, I take a walk for 10 minutes. And even if it's something small, right? It needs to feel accessible. It needs to feel like something that is feasible for you. It cannot feel like another thing you're adding to the to-do list that's a burden, right? So I am inundated with messaging all the time, like, hey, Jasmine, like you should take an aromatherapy bubble bath at the end of every day. And I'm like, excuse me, do you know my life? Because there's no way that's happening. And it just feels like another way that I've failed myself. We don't want your micro routines to feel that way, right? So it's really important for those micro routines to be accessible, to not take too much time, to not cost a ton of money, and be feasible to build into every single one of your days with it at a predictable schedule. And that's what's going to help to heal your brain. Um, and then just remembering on the next slide that our well-being is multifaceted, right? So we are thinking about our well-being in all of these different areas. Are you taking care of your financial well-being, your emotional well-being? Look at these different categories and think about, I'm sure that there are those of us who are doing really well in one of these categories, but maybe there's another category that you identify where you're like, oh yeah, I could use some work there, right? Like maybe I'm really on top of paying my bills and I take good care of my financial well-being, but like, man, that intellectual well-being, like that book that I've been meaning to read, I haven't been doing that. So I build in reading 1 page a day. Like maybe that's my self-care, right? So just remember that it's multifaceted. It's not one-dimensional. Next slide, please. Now, up until this point, we have been focusing on your individual well-being, and that's super, super important. But I also want to acknowledge that this is really difficult. Like it's really difficult for us in helping professions to take care of ourselves and to engage in all of these different kinds of rest if we don't have the systems and conditions in place to support our wellness, right? So for those of you who are in leadership positions, in your communities or your organizations, for those of you who are thinking about how systems work, if you are a manager, if you supervise a team, I want to remind you that it is incumbent upon you to provide systems and conditions within your organization to promote healing, right? So let's go to the next slide and talk about what that means. Um, so we know that organizations can provide conditions for teams to thrive, and they can be the reason that teams burn out, right? Organizations can be healing or they can be re-traumatizing for folks. And one of the conversations that we're having about workforce now is that we want to diversify the workforce, right? We always say like we want the workforce to reflect the people that we're serving. And that doesn't mean that we're just supposed to look at racial, ethnic, or linguistic diversity. It is diversity of lived experiences, right? I think that the most powerful folks who can make a difference in these areas are people who have gone through these struggles themselves and come out the other side, right? So if we are really looking to diversify the workforce, that means that the people joining us are going to come from lived experiences of trauma, come with lived experience of substance use and substance use disorder. And maybe it's about changing simple things like our HR policies or the language we use to talk about it. Cypress provides technical assistance to different organizations that want to do this work, right? And I think that it's a really courageous thing to call somebody up and say like, hey, I would like to try to change some of our policies to make sure that we're actually supporting the people who work with us. That is a courageous thing. So for those of you who are leaders and you're already talking about things like that, kudos to you, because it is really, really hard work, and it takes brave people who are willing to have complex conversations and to challenge systems that have existed for a really long time in order to make a real difference in organizational capacity for healing, right? And so when we think about, like I told you, Cypress's most requested workshops are around toxic stress and burnout and de-escalation. There's a reason for that. And we want to ensure that we are equipping our organizations with the capacity for healing. Next slide, please. So remember that wellness is going to look different for every community because all of our lived experiences differ. And so it's about, again, making that assessment of what your community needs, what your workforce needs, what the folks within your organization are really saying about the stressors, and how to promote rest within their work environments. Next slide, please. And we want to make sure that we are not hurting people, but helping them. So if you look at this slide, we have, and it feels like, sometimes when I look at this, I'm like, well, it's self-explanatory. It's supposed to, we all know this at some level, but um, when you've been on the receiving end of an interaction with a system that has been humiliating or disrespectful or impersonal or critical or judgmental, then you realize that there is a significant impact for all of the folks that we're serving, right? And that when we're not setting up conditions and systems that are kind and patient and reassuring and calm and promote safety, then we can be doing a disservice to not only our workforce, but the clients that we serve. Next slide, please. Now, this is probably the cutest slide in the presentation, but again, like I was saying earlier, moving through trauma means recovering, right? But not in isolation. Connection is totally required. And so we try really hard to, like, self-care, yes, we all should take care of ourselves, and we should surround ourselves with people who are also willing to take care of us. Right. And I think for those of us who are in these helping professions or play caregiver roles in our lives, it's really common for us to be like, oh, I take care of this for somebody else, or like, I'm the first one to jump in and say, I'll do it, I'll volunteer for that. And we're not so great at accepting help from others on the flip side, right? I recently had a surgery, and it was so hard for me to accept even a ride home from the hospital for someone. I was like, Jasmine, you're tripping. What is going on? So it's something to remember. We can't recover in isolation. We have to, be in that uncomfortable space of being able to raise a hand and say, hey, I could use some help here. And this is, that I can't do this alone. And it's the truth. Our brain cannot heal in isolation. So I'll show you this last slide. This is one of my very favorite images of all time. This is what co-regulation looks like. This image, you see how the same parts of the brain on both of these people are lit up. This is what we can do just by being in the same space with someone. We can influence where their brains are lighting up. We can influence that sense of safety just by being you, just by being present, by caring, having compassion every single day with the clients and communities that you serve. When you are sitting there with somebody, whether it's Zoom or on the telephone or in person, you being present with them promotes healing. And it's a really beautiful example of how human brains can talk to each other. We don't recover in isolation, we recover together. And remember that, engaging in these 7 types of brain rest that we talked about today, that's what helps you show up in this way for somebody else. So thank you so much for listening. I'm so grateful to have been here today. And I think we get to go to Q&A now.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. That was fantastic. And you can see that with all of the heart recognition that's coming here right from across the country was just very good. And I have to share that when you do this presentation, when Brooke from your team has done this presentation, I take it as an opportunity to do some creative rest. And I whip out the crayons, folks can't see this here. So I've been doing some drawing. I'm working on my daughter's birthday card right now. Liz, is an opportunity to get some creative rest. I've done it the past couple times, and I really appreciate that opportunity. So thank you for the reminder. A couple questions that have come up that I want to share with the group before we close out. I think this is a really important one, and I love that you do the organizational development work that you all do. This person is looking for recommendations for phrases to use or approaches for bosses, coworkers that are causing increased stress to help them understand the impact that they're having of others. How do you message and have that conversation with bosses, with colleagues that are causing stress to help them really understand some of the issues that we're talking about today?
Yeah, that's a really awesome question. I think a lot of what we do in those interpersonal interactions are, um, you know, that's really critical, right? And a lot of us spend a lot of time managing up in that way. So I appreciate you asking this. I think it's about having a candid conversation, but also talking about kind of culture overall, right, within an organization. I think some phrases that I might use are just to describe how I've been feeling, to give feedback about the interactions, specific interactions that may have made me feel this way. Maybe suggesting a training like this one to your boss or manager that may be having a hard time navigating this, but also remembering that when we talk about trauma, we want to reframe from like what um what's wrong with you to what happens to you, right? So chances are when somebody is engaged in this sort of re-traumatizing behavior or perpetuating a system that doesn't promote healing, they have gone through their own stuff as well. And so walking into the conversation with an understanding of that and that approach of like what happened, not that you're saying it out loud to them, but like what happened instead of um um what's wrong with you can make a difference in the way that that feedback is received, I think.
Great. Yeah, that's a really, really important reminder. And I think along those lines, curious, and I think with these types of rest, those are all good examples. But for folks who are struggling with boundaries when it comes to work and life, is there any kind of key takeaways that you want folks to have in terms of how they can kind of protect their boundaries and kind of that separation between the work that they do and the rest of their lives?
Yeah, I think that this has been something that a lot of us have experienced even more since the pandemic, and many of us are, working virtually in addition to working in person. There's hybrid work, all of that, and so I know for me, I work way more now than I did before because there's no such thing as a commute to give me space. There's no, you all are in my guest room right now in my house, so every time I walk past my laptop, I'm tempted to answer those emails. My advice would be to start small. So instead of going cold turkey and setting like a huge boundary that's going to have a ton of impact, setting aside, is it your micro routines, your 5 minutes a day, or saying, instead of saying no to that meeting entirely, shifting the meeting from an hour to 50 minutes so that you get that 10-minute gap to rest. That's a practice that we've built into our organization lately is like instead of hour-long meetings, we now have 50-minute meetings because it allows us to intentionally build in those bio breaks, that time to switch gears mentally. So I would say start small and then you get practice at setting those boundaries and you realize that maybe that has enough of an impact that you feel well enough to tackle the next boundary.
Perfect. That's really, really helpful and good tip for those to kind of make the progress that we want to make in terms of our own well-being and care. So thank you so much, Jasmine. Just really, really fantastic. I'm going to close us out now. The couple things, our next webinar on the 26th of this month is on Overdose Prevention 101. We've developed and we'll be posting an online resource for you to share with those in your community, colleagues who are new to this work. It has links and overviews of what we think are really kind of the important fundamentals of doing this work in overdose prevention. And we also have a rural version of the guide that will be posted online as well. So look forward to that. And then we'll be showcasing it during the webinar on the 26th. And this is posted up on our website at nopen.org, so you can register there. And then, of course, as mentioned earlier, please register for NOPLS, the National Overdose Prevention Leadership Summit coming up on November 16th and 17th. It is free. So spread the word, make sure you're there. We're going to have just really excellent speakers from across the country, and it's always just a really fabulous event. So look forward to seeing you all there. And with that, thank you again to Jasmine. Thank you to you all to taking the time to be with us today for today's webinar. We will see you next time.